There's a scene in chapter 14 of Chainsaw Man that I come back to fairly often. Not for the art, not for the Aki backstory, but for the introduction to one of the most striking backdrops used in this story: a graveyard. Among all the distinct settings that Tatsuki Fujimoto uses throughout Part 1, the graveyard is in many ways the most otherworldly, fittingly almost akin to hell in the way it stretches on forever with nothing except repeating headstones. It's used to display the sheer amount of death that humanity has already suffered at the hands of the devils, and drive home the point that, eventually, this is where all devil hunters end up. That even for humanity's bravest and strongest fighters, the final resting spot is the same as everyone else's, in the ground. And in that way, as far as the story's settings go, the graveyard is honestly the most normal. The final act of humanity is death. Fast, slow, accident, disease. It's one of the only truly ubiquitous human conditions. If you're alive, you will die. So it's no wonder that the idea of death has had a vice grip on storytelling since humans began telling stories. Stories exist in part to grapple with nebulous concepts and parts of life that we don't entirely understand, kind of like the ticking time bomb hanging over everyone's head. There is an obsession with death in fiction and how it affects our understanding of it. That will never change. Death has no truth for the living. There is no empirical way to observe what comes after. The world of fiction is the only place humanity has to truly explore it in endless iteration. It is an incredibly important bastion for not only our own ephemeral existence, but also our own peace of mind. An attempt to reach even a modicum of understanding before our time is up. But far less nobly, it's also become attached to a strange form of critique. That a story isn't mature enough because nobody dies, that a story needs to keep its characters dead to create stakes, on and on it goes. There's this idea that death is a crucial component of any meaningful fictional story, and must be included to validate the quality of the work. If a story is incapable of grappling with death in a meaningful way, it's a story for small baby children. The problem, beyond the fact that plenty of media for children do have something meaningful to say about death, is that death in fiction is incredibly difficult to pull off effectively. While it can be an easy way to shock your audience or make them cry, it very rarely captures the essence of our final moments. Many stories will draw out a character's death throes for dramatic effect, adding a memorable final monologue or a tragic death in the arms of another. However, just as many stories will swing wildly in the other direction, throwing character death around like candy and making sure you know that no one is safe. It's hard for a story to be able to toe the line between the realism and reverence that death deserves, to really capture its anguish, but also its finality. For such a ubiquitous human experience, we sure can be bad at putting it into words. Not that we don't try. To be honest, I'm not sure Chainsaw Man does this particularly better than any other stories, even in its own medium. But I don't remember the last story I've read that is able to live in death without being consumed by it. Chainsaw Man is not a story about death, it is a story about life, about living. Yet it revels in the idea of using death while still being able to pay it respect when it needs to. It would be significantly faster for me to list out the characters who make it to the end of Part 1 than it would be to list out the named characters who are killed off in just 97 chapters. The story shreds through important and semi-important characters like soft cheese, and yet never loses its edge. There's no fatigue, there's no lessening of the impact. Despite throwing death around entirely freely, it never cheapens it, or perhaps more importantly, never portrays it unrealistically. And I think it's necessary to look at how this story uses death to such an effect. Because death is final, but it also colors everything that came before. If it wasn't obvious from the subject material, everything moving forward will spoil the entirety of Chainsaw Man Part 1, so if you're an anime only that stumbled upon this and you're also somehow still here, I love you and please leave for your own good. A fitting place to start feels like the first death in the story, which surprisingly is Denji's. Unless you want to be pedantic, then it's the Tomato Devil. Denji's initial death is a nice introduction to how this story works. It's cold, calculating, and brutal. It's a nice morbid reminder that death does not care if your life was awful or great, it comes just the same. Now, Denji does not stay dead, and yes, that's not how it works in real life, you got me, but I still think killing off the main character in any capacity almost immediately is a pretty good sneak peek into how the rest of this is going to go. Even the character who cannot die is still inexorably linked to death. It's also not all consequence-free either. When a story utilizes immortality well, it becomes less of a get-out-of-jail-free card, and more about the way that ability functions in conjunction with the purpose of dying, with the added bonus that sometimes the main character can light themselves on fire. Its use early on here also sets a misleading precedent, that death can be cheated, that it's not permanent. It lowers your guard and lulls you into that familiar shonen zone. This premise may be crazy, but per usual, the main cast is safe from harm. Unfortunately, that couldn't be further from the truth. In retrospect, Himeno's death is actually somewhat of an outlier in the story, and I think part of that is because of its symbolism as the first among any significant cast member. Chainsaw Man is not the first Shonen Jump property to kill off a prominent character early in its run, and it's not the first manga to continue to kill off characters with impunity. That doesn't mean the first meaningful death in this story is not unexpected. Without the power of hindsight, there's no real reason at this point to expect Chainsaw Man to be a story where important characters who just got developed, are discarded. Himeno's death is a genuine surprise, one that the story is only able to pull off a few more times in the next 70 or so chapters. It's an outlier in that way, an exclamation point on the intro to a young story, but also in the way it's portrayed. I want to touch on Arai and the other Devil Hunters from this arc here because I feel like that is the first time the story uses what I like to call realistic death. These characters are shot and they are dead, and that's it. They have been removed from the story. It is immediate, it is final, it is unjust, and guns don't care. Every single Devil Hunter in the entire story is an example of this. Fujimoto goes through these guys like he's eating a can of Pringles, often using them as fodder to set up how strong the new villain is. Time and time again, normal humans are matched up with superhuman killing machines, and they almost always end up dead. Himeno, on the other hand, gets a dramatic sacrifice, the kind of death that a lot of shonen stories use exclusively. If a hero is going to go down, they're going to go down fighting. In the anime, the music swells, Himeno gets a classic sacrificial monologue, the villain gets beaten back, and then she fails. And that's where Himeno is used to ground this story. Despite the theatrics, despite the dramatic sacrifice, her actions are in vain. She is dead and her friends are still in danger. It's subverting the idea of safety in the core shonen cast, and then subverting the expectation again that a sacrifice would be a trump card. This is then only supported by the fact that Aki basically does the same thing and also fails. There are no ways to cheat death, there are no get-out-of-jail-free cards in this story. The only way off Mr. Fujimoto's wild ride is to die. This is where Chainsaw Man really starts to build its own identity, both as a series and in how it handles death. From this point forward, you're a bit more on edge. Even the general comfort you may have felt about Power or Aki is, rightfully, shaken a bit here, only to then be proven partially correct by the walking Chekhov's gun that is Aki's remaining lifespan. Himeno permanently alters the tone of the story, and rightfully is one of only two characters that gets dedicated mourning time. Her sacrifice may not have worked, but at least she gets what she wanted. Aki is still alive to cry for her. For a scenario in which the affected party died by disappearing after offering herself up to a ghost devil to fight a man with a katana for a head, it all feels extraordinarily real. The aftermath of it anyway. Hell, this is what sparks Denji's incredibly fraught "do I have a heart" crisis, and the first step towards his inevitable despair. It's an important moment of maturity for a story just coming into its own. It's also the last time we'll really be afforded the time to think about the effects of loss for quite a while. Because as much as I'd like to talk about all these Pringles, the next character I genuinely want to look at is Reze. And to make this simpler, we're going to jump ahead and include Quanxi here as well, as my view on each of them is fairly similar. Fujimoto is not kind to his villains. The man is so comfortable with killing off semi-important antagonists that he will do it for bits. He will dedicate time to introducing a character, usually a villain, and then kill them off in the next chapter. This happens more than once. But Reze and Quanxi are different. Reze gets away. Quanxi helps Denji fight a greater evil. These are characters who have interesting pasts and intriguing futures. They aren't as cartoonishly evil as some of our other clown show examples, which makes it all the more significant when those futures are ripped away. Initially, I was pretty upset that interesting villains were simply discarded without regard to how they may be able to show up later, and well, I kinda still stand by that, although it was cool to see them come back under Makima. Albeit they kinda just get jobbed the entire time. This is my nice way of saying that they are used as weapons and not actual characters once they come back, and that makes me sad. But tonally appropriate sad. Hey, remember earlier when I said immortality was not consequence-free? However, what also made me sad was their actual deaths. A remarkable thing to accomplish in a story where both characters kill hundreds of people in a very short amount of time. I grouped these two together in theory, but physically their deaths could not have been more different. Reze's is agonizing, a literal spear through the heart as she's just meters away from potentially reconciling with the only person that genuinely cares about her. Dirty and bleeding out in a dark alley, outmaneuvered by a woman who literally materialized from rats. It remains consistent with every other death. It's unfair. She never gets to say whatever she was going to say to Denji, and her emotional attachment is what got her killed. The world is as cold and calculating as the woman who runs it. Quanxi's death by comparison is downright sterile. A swift slice through the neck, almost mirroring what she did to Denji just moments earlier. She barely has time to register what happened. But as is often the case, it's someone else, Kishibe, who is more emotionally affected by the outcome. Kishibe not taking off his blindfold is the closest he comes to breaking his stoic character at any point in the story, and it's honestly heartbreaking how much is conveyed in just one sentence. This is the end of an arc, the villain is dead, Denji is saved, and yet we're all left feeling like the captain. Death can shake even the most hardened of survivors if it resonates emotionally. Darkness Devil is one of the most recognizable scenes from the manga for this reason. From the iconic page with the disemboweled astronauts down to Darkness Devil's very design, its entire mystique is drenched in the themes of death. Think about why. We as a species are programmed to be afraid of the dark because something might be out there that can kill us. It's as much of a fear of darkness as it's a fear of death, cold, crippling, and unknowing. And boy is Fujimoto able to capture that feeling here. I'm usually not a huge fan of set-piece fights where one side is just so overwhelmingly strong it's a bloodbath, but it's used to such effect to capture the abject despair on display. From the very first moment, things are off. An entire spread dedicated to just how screwed they all are, followed up by a systematic and almost matter-of-fact decimation of nearly every single character we've been following up to this point. The traditional heroic last-ditch effort from violence doesn't even leave a scratch. Even Makima is barely enough to drag the few survivors back to the land of the living. Hell is real, and this is what it looks like. It's not a particularly long scene, all things considered, but it leaves 7 characters dead, and even the survivors are irreparably changed. We want to talk about emotional scarring. This is the event that essentially breaks Aki. He survives, but the trauma is what leads directly to his death. Kopeni quits, finally pushed over the edge to do so, and Power, the goofy jokester, has PTSD for almost the entire rest of her time in the series. This trip to hell is a turning point in the series and a breaking point for many. It's a moment that is rightfully revered by the audience and one that I think firmly solidifies death as a key component of what really makes this series tick. Much of the remaining time in Part 1 is spent attempting to come to grips with this loss. It's felt in every corner of the story, and interestingly has a peculiar foil in another overpowered devil's appearance. The Gun Devil was supposed to be the final boss of this story. In the minds of the reader, this is a being of unknowable power, so destructive that we aren't even shown its form, just the casualty numbers it left behind. If anything, the Darkness Devil fight almost deifies Gun Devil even more. If we're already seeing this guy, how strong is the gun? Even after all that, there's still no way to prepare yourself for it to actually show up. There is no way to verbalize the amount of human carnage. Even reading it, Even if I read out every single name on these pages, we are incapable of internalizing the actual loss of life on display. It's awe-inspiring in the most terrifying way possible. You are frozen, with nothing to do but turn the page, try to understand the time that has passed and the names that continue to bombard you. Eventually you give up trying to read all the names, give up trying to find if there's some reference or secret hidden in the text. There isn't. There is nothing tongue-in-cheek here, no ulterior motive. It is rote, unfeeling notation. These are statistics, innocent sacrifices for the greater good, names that you won't even remember in a few pages, let alone as the story progresses. It's maybe the scariest part of the whole thing. Even the story itself seems to move on, celebrating the defeat of the Gun Devil, with no more word on the death it left in its wake. It's startlingly real, a battle between two geopolitical superpowers ending in thousands dead and very little changed. It's death on such a massive scale that it almost becomes numbing. In fact, we know it is. Replace a devil with something like maybe an invading army or an airborne disease, and I think you can see the power on display here. Yet the audience's biggest concern isn't with the destruction, it's the fact that a main character just died. It's a wonderful play around real death. Numbers are just numbers, names are names. We're just not built to grieve on a massive scale. There's no way for your brain to actually comprehend what that large number means. But someone you know, someone you spent a lot of time with, even fictionally, that just burrows a lot deeper. Think about which scene was more traumatic for a large swath of the audience. The scene where 7 characters die, including multiple well-loved ones, or the scene where thousands upon thousands of lives are lost. Somehow, using 2 separate disastrous scenes, Fujimoto is able to capture our own relationship with the past few years in just remarkable fashion. And I think the story knows this, immediately transitioning away from the Gun Devil, not even showing the god-shattering fight, opting to cut to a much more intimate one instead. The worst kept secret in part 1 is that at some point, Aki is going to die, and if Future Devil is to be believed, it will be in the worst way possible. Aki's death is easily the most tragic, purely upsetting scene in the entire series. Just the realization that the gun fiend is Aki's corpse itself is enough to add real, unimaginable weight to this fight. So much so that the story takes the time to build up the tension, something it rarely likes to do, with the eventual reveal of one of the most striking full-page drawings in the series, and the absolutely gut-wrenching line from Power that still sticks with me. But that's not possible. It was Aki's scent in the entranceway. The fight with Denji is barely a fight at all. It's by far the least visually understandable fight Fujimoto has ever drawn, and that's because the action isn't the point. It's the depressing emotional significance of every page, the slow realization that even though Aki appears to be in there somewhere, that even though he can still tell that Denji is in front of him, he's not coming back. It's all displayed in the heartbreaking agony of a children's game, a snowball fight, intersplicing the snowy, sterile world of Aki's mind with the grim, bloody reality he's leaving behind. Aki in the form of a child who has not yet experienced death, who has not yet lost everything and been shaped into the single-minded broken man he would become. The man whose sole mission in life was to defeat the Gun Devil and who died doing just that, only to be rewarded by losing his body to the very evil he hoped to destroy. It is a Greek tragedy in its purest form. The one blessing that Aki receives is that he is never forced to learn about what happened. There is no moment of reckoning for him. Denji takes the brunt of his sins onto himself and frees Aki, finally able, all these years later, to just play catch with his brother. The reader experiences this arc alongside Denji himself, clinging onto the hope that maybe somehow there's a way to fix this, to bring Aki back to his senses, knowing full well what manga they're reading and how Fujimoto has already predetermined these things go. Aki dies 2 deaths. When Makima uses him to help her defeat the Gun Devil, his abilities are defined as ante-mortem devil contracts. As soon as he is forced to accept her contract, The man known as Aki Hayakawa is dead. But technicality only matters so much when emotions are involved, and we don't truly know how fiends work. Violence mentions that he remembers most of his human life, so maybe, just maybe? No. Denji is backed into a corner, and in striking opposition to the aspects of the Gun Devil scene we discussed earlier, he chooses the lives of many over the life of his adoptive older brother. In order to save people he does not even know, Denji kills the most important person in his life. Something that I think is overlooked due to the overall level of violence on display in the manga is that Denji doesn't really do a lot of actual killing relative to a lot of the cast. He's never knowingly killed another person as Chainsaw Man. This doesn't make him a saint by any means, but that does mean that in his mind, the first person he's ever killed is Aki. Of all the powerful panels in this manga, two of the ones that will stick with me forever are Aki died, I killed Aki. Compare this to the thoughts Denji has after Himeno dies, after his first real personal loss. He doesn't even think he'd cry if Aki died. But in the time since, he's learned to live. He's learned to love in a way very different than he outwardly thinks. Loss is so much more meaningful when you actually have something to lose. The story's stance on death never changes between Himeno and Aki, but Denji's does. Aki was always there to bear the emotional weight. He's the one who cries for others. But when he's gone, who is there to cry for him? There's no true recovery from this. This is the depths of despair, a type of darkness that really only death can bring, the finality of losing something that made your life worth living. It's such a powerful moment, and it speaks to the ubiquity of this feeling that it resonates with the audience so strongly. A scene that essentially boils down to a man with a chainsaw for a head fighting a man with a gun for a head is able to elicit emotions that transcend the plot, transcend the medium even. It's a moment we've all experienced before, in mostly a far less direct and traumatic fashion, where we as humans are forced to learn how to grieve. We are forced to come to terms with the fact that we will spend our entire lives losing precious things, and it's how you move on from that, how you use it, that helps make you human. Denji's desire to not reckon with it, to not mourn his best friend, and in his word, become a dog, only causes him more suffering, and is what ultimately leads to Power's death as well. Now, I do think it's unfair to lay that entirely on the feet of Denji. Clearly Makima had this all planned out from the beginning, but Denji's desire to avoid any more hurt is ironically what sets this all in motion. Power's first death is honestly one of the most insano things I've ever seen a storyteller do. What if I took my fan-favorite character and just unceremoniously killed them immediately for no discernible reason? Obviously there is a reason, but that exposition comes later. The reader is essentially as confused as Denji is when Power shows up with a cake and then instantly dies. Of all the scenes I'm looking forward to the anime reaction to, I think this is the first. Actually, I lied, the Reze tongue bite is the first, but work with me here. And this build-up we've had, these rules of death we've established, sell the finality of her death. How many times have we seen characters unceremoniously die? That's Darkness Devil's entire bit. It's in such direct contrast to the agonizing send-off that Aki gets. But aside from Himeno, kind of, no one gets that kind of emotional scene. Similar to real life, people just die for no discernible reason. You might want to think it's a bad dream, you might want to deny it's even happening, but all that's happened is you've already entered the stages of grief. Now, if this actually was the full stop end for Power, I think there would be even more to say about how it thematically mirrors Aki's death. But luckily for her, and Denji, there's a little more power left in the tank. Power's final goodbye is my favorite moment in part 1, and it's the moment that solidifies for me the true theme death has in this story. I think a story about death would have kept Power dead. It would have focused even more on the despair and hopelessness of the situation. But that's not what the core of this story is about. It's about living on through the suffering that death can bring. Now, the story is not overly kind, life isn't, and that's not why power is brought back. She's brought back to save Denji, physically, but also emotionally. Denji gives up on living a normal life. He determines that without his newfound emotional bonds, there's nothing to live for. And in that deduction, he shows just how much he still has to learn about his emotions. All lives are equally trivial, including mine. So any death, even my own, is nothing to be sad about. But Denji can't die, because Denji's my first friend. A single human life is exceptionally trivial in the grand scheme of things, but life isn't about rote mathematical calculations. It's about relationships, it's about emotional connection, it's about giving love and receiving it. Power is able to come back solely because of the care and love Denji showed her during her darkest time. She is simply repaying the favor. And Denji sort of knows all of this, he's just stuck on the first part. He knows that he's been inflicted by intense sadness about the loss of his friends, and he knows that they're never coming back. And he hasn't yet learned about what comes next. The sadness is normal, the brain fog is normal, the mourning is normal. But so is coming out on the other side, changed, but alive. Emotionally scarred, but living. Keep living, keep fighting, find a new blood devil and befriend it, make new friends, make new bonds. This is not the end. It can't be, or else all of Power and Aki's efforts would be in vain. Power is going directly against what Makima tries to do to Denji. She is telling him that if you lose someone, don't give up, don't despair, honor them, remember them, and keep moving forward. And so he does. He picks himself up and marches on, but not before calling out Power's name one last time. But this time, she's gone for good. As much as big, dramatic, emotion-shaking grief is a part of death, so is the immediacy and finality of it. There often isn't some dramatic scene where someone gets to say something cool or thought-provoking. People just die and they're gone. It can happen suddenly and it can happen at any time, and that's the power that Chainsaw Man is able to capture. A power that you can't truly grapple with while you're reading it, or it may reduce the impact of the story. Just like how you can't fully internalize that feeling in real life, or else you'll be nothing but a paranoid mess. It's best to take those lazy days for granted, instead of ruining them with what-ifs. Fujimoto's story implementation is far from perfect. You certainly start getting a bit desensitized to the violence as you work your way through, and for all the reverence I do think this story shows to death, it also kills off random people in funny gag situations. So, you know, it kinda handles it like it handles everything else, fast and loose. No, I do not think the Kobeni Burger chapter helps support my thesis, thank you for asking. But Chainsaw Man is able to pull off its mastery by making sure it doesn't take those lazy days for granted. It is a story about so much death and suffering, but it's also a story about how you can keep going. How no matter the cost, giving up is always worse. It's a telling part of this ethos that so many fans have a deep love for characters who are killed off, many only having a few significant contributions to the story. I mean, two of my favorite characters are Beam and Violence. What you do in life matters. No matter how small that contribution may be, the memory you leave behind matters. Because the one thing that remains after a person dies is their memory. In some ways, it's a functional immortality of human existence, if not a bodily one. For many of us, being forgotten is far more frightening than simply the act of dying. This is then perfectly represented by the fact that the most powerful ability in this entire world is Chainsaw Man's ability to wipe away even the memory of his victims. Chainsaw Man eats memories. Not only does he kill, he desecrates, he leaves nothing behind. It is not death, it is nothingness. The void. In a way, it's not even that. That would imply the absence of something. This is somehow even more horrifying. It's like you never even existed. It goes against both life and death. breaking the cycle the two uphold and completely shaping the structure of the world. It's framed as an absolutely horrific power controlled by pure chaos. What can you possibly do if your opponent has the ability to wipe you from existence? What would you be without your memories? Nothing. Your memories, the bonds you create in life, are the most important aspect of living. Makima's death is the final little piece inside our death-shaped puzzle here. Denji is only able to win that battle thanks to everything he's learned from everyone he's created bonds with along the way. He wins not through overwhelming power, not by channeling Chainsaw Man's ability to erase the existence of the Control Devil, but like a human. Using the skills that Kishibe taught him, he outwits the smartest character in the story, with the killing blow being dealt while he's dressed like Aki and using Power's blood. There's no better full circle moment than that. Denji moves forward, just like Power told him to, just like Aki would want, already building a new found family with Nayuta and the dogs. He may not be living it up like he wanted, and he may not be living the exact life he dreamed about, but he has learned the importance of living. Death may be rife in this story, it may rip away fan-favorite characters and cause untold suffering, but it still holds an important spot in our existence. Because death, or perhaps the impending threat of it, is what gives life meaning. It's what makes waking up every day worthwhile. Experiencing new things, reading new stories, meeting new people. The limited time we have is what makes it all so much more significant. Chainsaw Man is not a story about death. It is a story about life. And because of that, it embraces death in a way that gives itself true meaning. The fragility of it all is what makes it so special.